Namaste, everybody, and welcome to Sangam Talks. And today we have with us Sri Ram Balasubramaniam. He's been a speaker with us earlier as well. That was in 2019, where he spoke on the relevance of Kautilya's economics. And now he's out with a book on it, which is really good news. And we were expecting it since a long time. So the basic question that we all ask each other whenever Arthashastra is debated is that since India was an economic power to reckon with until its economic decline in the 18th century, what explained this long period of prosperity? And Sriram Balasubramaniam in his book Kautilyanomics talks about the answer lying in the social and economic thought that lies buried in our ancient heritage. And Kautilya's Arthashastra is the foremost and the book that needs to be read in detail to understand that. So Sriram Balasubramaniam is an economist. Sriramji, I would like you to talk about your book a little.
Namaste to your viewers. Thanks, Sangam Talks again, for inviting me to share my thoughts. Firstly, this is the cover of the book. For those interested, please do buy a copy. It's available on Amazon. I think it's been a very interesting exercise. Most of your listeners would have, listened to my earlier lecture as part of the Srijan Foundation, which is now evolved into Sangam Talks, where I was at a mid phase of my research for the book. So this is one of the earlier venues where I sort of bounced off some of these ideas, and it sort of played an important part in sort of evaluating some of these ideas, and then progressing them to the book. So I think in that sense, not just for the listeners, I think Sangam Talks has done service for even practitioners and researchers, so that constant evolution of feedback and evolution of thought, which takes which helps us to reinforce our thoughts in terms of books. So the difference between my earlier lecture essentially focused on some of the ideas of Kautilya, and some of the economic ideas of Kautilya, and in today's lingo, in terms of taxation, in terms of trade, in terms of labor, in terms of justice, and things like. So it is sort of in that context. But what this book tries to achieve is take that a step further, and establish an economic framework for Kautilya's thinking. I think it is important to understand the motivation of the book. Why did I, get into the research? I have said this in a couple of my previous lectures. I was working on Angus Madison's data set of economic history, which is often quoted, but very few people actually look into the data set. It has 1,000 year sort of history, economic history, from 0 CE onwards till about 17th, 18th century, or even 19th century, in terms of data on GDP per capita, and things like that. So that sort of, gave us a clear indication that India and China were one of the top sort of countries in terms of these macroeconomic indicators. And even though population was sort of a proxy in those years, I mean, that's sort of the criticism for this kind of data set. I think there's enough anecdotal evidence in terms of what people have traveled. I mean, the places people have traveled within India, and the accounts of those travelers, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Greeks, whether it's other travelers. They sort of reinforce this notion that Bharat was a prosperous place during this time. So my intuitive understanding was there had to be sort of a framework which facilitated this. I think Arthashastra sort of sets me in that zone. And it was challenging because you needed multiple types of skill sets. One is to understand the text, the Sanskritam text, then Sanskritam, work with Sanskritam scholars, and then try to decipher the text, and then lay out some of the ideas that are there, which my previous presentation would sort of facilitated some of those ideas, and then create a framework. which is applicable to today's times, and then contextualize it to today's time. So in that sense, the book tries to sort of do all this, and that's why it took me quite a while, about 5 years, to sort of get this into motion, because um, very limited literature is available on the Artha part of the Arthashastra. So the very good book by Balbir Sehakji. But other than that, there are only a few others. Satish Deodar, Professor at IIM, and a few other scholars who have worked on this. So the experience and exposure in terms of what is needed is so a lot of original work had to come through. So that's why many people talk about Chanakya or Kautilya, many people talk about Yasashastra, but very few people actually do the due diligence to read it completely. And there are very few translations as well, and most of them, the earliest translation is 30 years old. Just to give you some perspective, I mean, there are other translations, but a sort of a translation people look at, and 4 or 5 translations, most of them are sort of quite old, and this requires a lot of subject matter expertise for each of the sections that Kautilya refers. So all of this sort of took the time that is required, but I think it's well uh, uh, worth it from what I've seen. And yeah, so this is where it is, and I'm glad the book is doing well. And just for the record, the views in the book are all, and my views are all my personal views. And I hope to gain more feedback in my subsequent work as part of these discussions and iterations on the book.
Thank you so much, Sriramji. It's interesting that you say that you've taken Arthashastra as the base and taken its whole understanding and modeled it in the current context. Now, a lot of people say that Kautilya is like 2 millennia back, and all it was in the Mauryan time, and this is all ancient times, and so we don't consider it in the contemporary sense. What motivated you, and what exactly is there which always keeps it relevant even in any age and time? What do you think?
Yeah, see, that's a fair question, right? I mean, that's a question for any historical work. I mean, why would you want to spend time on something that was 1,000 years old or 2,000 years old? What is the value add are you going to get? We live in a different world. We live in a technological sort of much advanced stage. Our data systems are very different. So why do you want to go back and study and analyze this, right? So I think the single, the answer that I generally give, the first answer is that irrespective of what scenario or what century we are in, I think fundamentally we are human beings. I think the idea of human instincts, human choices that determine your economic activity. Fundamentally, I mean, as a human being, we remain the same. We might have evolved, the context around us might have evolved, but in a subject such as economics, which is highly driven by individual choices, I think the human beings sort of construct is a constant during all this time. So I think in that sense, whether it was Kautilya, whether it was Adam Smith, whether it's the current scenario or the current world view or the world at large, it still deals with how human beings react, whether it's to policies, whether it's to incentives, whether it's through taxation, whether it's through trade. Eventually, human beings have to make those decisions to make these commercial activities. And those decisions are still made by individuals. So I think in that sense, I think a lot of the earlier literature sort of gives us a segue into how these thinkers sort of dealt with some of these issues, which are, related. So that I think would be one main reason. The second reason is I think what fascinated me about Kautilya is that I think the Mauryan sort of dynasty was one of the pioneers in terms of the scale of their dominance, right? In terms of how much in both land and area that they occupied. And the sheer persona of Kautilya was something very fascinating because here was a guy who is, who had knowledge in a wide range of subjects, who was very practical in his approach, and yet had some of these ideas and implemented some of them from his practical experience, and kept it as a book or sort of a template. And the third thing, which again I felt fascinated by, was if you look at the Arthashastra as a text, it is sort of context agnostic in the sense that you wouldn't see specific references to what the Mauryan kings need to do or what individual kingdoms need to do. The text per se is very, very context agnostic. He's written it in a way where this is how he sees the world, and you can use it whenever you want or whatever you want to pick from this and use it, because he probably understood the practical limitations of governance and things like that. So in that sense, the text is it doesn't really um, uh, refer to a particular context, but we assume that it refers to the Mauryan context because obviously Kautilya was aligned to the Mauryan Empire, and there's a very good chance that a lot of these principles were applied there. What I'm trying to say is it's not a one-to-one fit, and Kautilya didn't sort of um, uh, see that as one-to-one fit. And also the continuity of ideas, right? I mean, there's a chapter in the book, the introductory chapter, where I sort of mention about some of these ideas which Kautilya himself acknowledges that came through earlier works, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Rig Veda and Yajur Veda, and how some of these texts were not just spiritual sort of philosophical texts. They had a subtle sort of laukik element in it. It's a Tamir's phrase for materialistic element within the text. So I think Kautilya himself acknowledges that the Arthashastra is a combination, collection of these ideas over a period of time. So that even sort of fascinated me. So I think this would be my answer. I mean, I would say that in a subject such as economics and public policy, where a lot of human interaction is involved, it would be wise to look at how some of the earlier or historical figures that have dealt with this. I'm not saying we have to follow everything. I'm not saying Kautilya is perfect. Kautilya himself doesn't say he's perfect, but there's definitely a set of ideas which can stimulate our thinking and help us sort of make things more effective in terms of execution and policy in today's.
Thank you, Sri Ramji. It's interesting that you mentioned about Kautilya combining our ancient knowledge with the Lokayat and the whole materialistic aspect to it, which is a combination. In today's times, we see this socialism and capitalism kind of joining together in the respect of our economy, Indian economy. So I just want to know that when he talks about the Purusharth and the Trivargi, which is the classification of the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas and Shudras, and that is how the economic classification happens. How do you see that in the current context today, these Purusharth and these three demarcations?
Yeah, I think the Purusharthas is very fundamental to sort of Kautilya's perspective. I would probably put that as a higher sort of emphasis. Because he firmly believes that the artha part of the Purusharthas is a sort of a base for practical policymakers, for example, to ensure that there is prosperity. He believed that prosperity was the key for political dominance, and that was clear. So he was one of the pioneers even during that time to sort of make this into such a scalable sort of concept and as a foundational concept. So the the idea of, the Purusharthas and the focus on the Artha, I think is a very important sort of conceptual underpinning, right? And I think that is where it takes us to the idea of, what you mentioned about socialism and capitalism. Um, Essentially, both socialism and capitalism, if you put it in a very simplistic sort of terms, yeah, it's basically the state and the market, right? So if you want the state to intervene more, then you want to the state puts in money, say for example, into infrastructure projects. The state, gets taxes from you, increases or reduces taxes. The state puts in rules and regulations for businesses, for example. And then the state collaborates with private sector and does whatever projects or some sort of commercial projects. And then you have the market. So the market functions on its own. It has, there are people who believe that the markets are self-correcting on their own, sort of a laissez-faire approach. And then the Keynesian approach was what I sort of mentioned about the state. But Kautilya's unique contribution, I feel, is that he brings in the idea of dharma into this picture. So linking the idea of artha with dharma, and he believes that the idea of dharmic capitalism is that dharma is foundational, acting as a self-correcting mechanism to both the state and the market. Instead of, correcting just the state on its own, the market on its own, Kautilya felt that dharma could play the role so that it liberates both the state and the market. And the burden falls on dharmic values and the idea of dharma. So I think that is probably the most profound sort of takeaway that I could mention. Besides the Purusharthas, in the sense that the focus on the Artha is key, but Dharma as a fountainhead or sort of a facilitator of that is a unique sort of contribution, I feel. So that's where the idea of dharmic capitalism comes in. It comes in between both these two sort of entities that you talk about.
So you're saying that's where it differentiates between this blind consumerism that we see today. Dharma kind of balances out, mitigates it.
Yeah, because in a sense that, for example, again, there are various definitions of dharma. I mean, we've discussed this for centuries. So I don't want to get into the the philosophical constructs of it, but purely for the material framework that we talk about, for the economic framework, we are referring in my book, I refer to three categories. One category is on ethics, another category is on responsibilities, another category is on harmony and sort of a global approach to things. And that sort of segues into the idea of a state which is strong but doesn't intervene too much into your day-to-day affairs. Wealth creation through a global outlook, through the idea of global harmony and things like that. And then the idea of sustainable growth and welfare, which again comes through responsibilities, whether it's environmental, societal, or personal responsibilities that we have. So what I'm trying to say is that if these pillars of ethics, responsibilities, and harmony are strengthened, then automatically they sort of map into the idea of the state and the market. Because the issues with the state and the market, whether it's corruption, state, whether it is, say, inefficiency in policy implementation, all of it can be, in Kautilya's view, sort of adjusted through the lens of dharma. So the more and more you sort of focused on that, I think he felt that the other things would sort of fall in line.
Thank you, Sriramji. Also, now we come to this very important aspect of Kautilya's Arthashastra, where he talks about Dandaniti, and that is like the enforcer of law. And he says that if you spare the rod or the dand, it leads to the law of fishes, which is Matsya Nyaya, which is something that needs to be avoided. Could you speak on that?
Yeah, that is, that's indeed true. In fact, the idea of Matsya Nyaya is there across the book. Sometimes directly, there are only one or two quotations which directly mention it. but the sense is something that you could see across the book. In fact, I just gave a recent lecture on at IIM Bangalore for your listeners. If they want to understand a full presentation of Matsya, they could refer to that, Google that and the YouTube lecture where I sort of talk into the various layers of Matsya, how to deal with Matsya, which Kautilya sort of propagated. But the basic principle of that is that he believed that unless you have a strong state, which means a state which can implement rules and regulations very strictly, and give whatever punishment that's required for people who violate it, you're going to have a situation where the bigger fish sort of always escapes and the smaller fish always is sort of victimized. So the idea is to ensure that no matter how big or small you are, the set of opportunities and due process you have in the system is fairly reasonable and transparent, and people have confidence in the system. Because this could also be since it is a politically very astute person, Kautilya would have definitely acknowledged that the majority of the population is generally the people who are the smaller fishes. The bigger fishes are generally the elite, who sort of, were generally minority in number. But without the support of the smaller fishes, he can't, politically run the system. So politically also he might have sort of felt that, that besides a sort of a moral approach, I think a politically astute thing is also to do that, to ensure that you empower the weaker people through these mechanisms. But again, the idea of Matsya could be viewed in other sense. It could be also viewed through an inequality sense, which is what my lecture, which I referred to, talks about. How do you sort of ensure that the gap between the rich and the poor is not too big to the point where the poor really get engulfed? So how do you sort of create systems, create mechanisms where the poor is supported? For example, Kautilya believed in the idea of redistribution, meaning targeted redistribution. He felt that people who actually deserved, say, during the pandemic, the government, for example, supported people with food grains. They supported people with for some folks, with levels of direct benefit transfer. So something very focused, where the needy is actually deserving. Kautilya would sort of help. Was open to the idea of redistribution. He was open to the idea of a flexible minimum wage. I think in my previous lecture, I've sort of dealt on it. So the idea of minimum wage, idea of labor contracts, transparency of labor contracts. Even if it's a very poor laborer, he or she needs to have a contract with the employee, and sort of template of these contracts need to be made public so that they are not taken for a ride. So at a systemic level, the idea of Matsya sort of goes everywhere in his thinking, where he feels that it's just not a large part of the focus is on the needy part that you mentioned, on the rules and implement, because the quotations basically refer to that. But at a sort of if you decipher the text more and more, the sense that you get is this is spread across in terms of a conceptual underpinning, because he believed the poor needs to be empowered.
Thank you, Sriramji. So I think that covers the concept of welfare in Kautilya's time. Now, coming to the whole, he has this whole UPSC kind of exam system also that goes on for the civil servants. So he covers good governance, he covers sustainable development, he covers decentralization, he covers the market, he covers all kinds of things which we talk about today through the United Nations and all these talks about good governance. Where exactly do you see the Indian political system or the state applying it in certain areas, and where they are failing, and what they need to do in order to go on the path that Arthashastra's economic policies say?
Yeah, that's I think an important question, right? I think the aim of such an exercise is to sort of have a constructive approach to things. Like, how do you sort of learn from these lessons, whatever that we feel is applicable, and how do you sort of enable better policy execution? I think that is the fundamental sort of uh, uh, premise which one needs to look at. So, in that sense, I think what because the fact that our systems are so different to those times, right? You can't. It's very difficult to systemically completely change things, right? It's not practical. But there are definitely, ways in which you can sort of. This is what I refer in the book as called dharmic nudges, which sort of facilitate greater execution of policy, right? To put it in very simplistic sort of terminology, let's take the idea of gas cylinders, right? Ujjwala, right? I think there was an effort done by the prime minister and uh, 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 to urge people who had these cylinders to give it for others, because if they had too many of them, the poor required it in terms of sort of sacrificing it for others, which was a very popular response. People reacted to it. But if you really think about it, what is this policy action? This policy action is basically triggering a sort of dharmic instinct in yourself to look at the bigger picture of things, which is helping others and ensuring that, even though you're giving away something that you already have for the benefit of the others, right? So if this sort of iteration can be done at a much bigger scale, say Swachh Bharat, for another example, it leads to your sort of cleanliness part of definition of dharma, which is saucham, and how the importance of cleanliness and your societal responsibility. Where you're thinking that keeping your house clean is important, keeping your society clean is important, and when you trigger that sort of instinct, then people, in a very structured and calibrated manner, then your outcomes of a clean society becomes far more higher. So this is far more effective. I mean, while rules and regulations are important to sort of get people, get people to do these things, but there's always that 10-15% sort of doesn't, or 15-20% doesn't follow these things for variety of reasons. But if it is through a sort of a nudging approach like this, which can sort of trigger a dharmic instinct, then I think the efficiency of current policy formulation is far higher, because you are going into a societal construct and getting into their sort of dharmic consciousness. I think in that sense, these sort of ideas can be used on a case-to-case basis on particular projects or particular policies where efficiencies are lower and people's sort of response levels aren't higher. So in that sense, it can be a very good sort of add-on to our current system rather than a sort of a wholesale change. And then the entire idea of data. I mean, I've often argued that we have a lot of sustainability indexes, sustainable goals, sustainable indices. You could always have a sort of a dharmic coefficient or index, which sort of gives you an idea of which can be formulated and it gives you a sort of a quantifiable metric, which can also enable better policy execution. So I think this sort of an approach would be far more constructive than a wholesale approach in today's context. Of course, there are some issues where this is required even more. I mean, if you take the idea of climate change again, right? Climate change primarily is sort of a behavioral issue. No matter what legislation or taxes that you impose on me or you, unless we as individuals have a clear sort of um, uh, uh, um, agenda or clear thinking to protect both ourselves and the environment, we wouldn't be making those actions. So on particular issues, I think there's a lot of relevance, which we can use it as an add-on Besides civilizational awareness, which I think is a very good thing, gains a lot of confidence that some of these civilizations which dominated uh, the large sections of the subcontinent had such ideas. I think in today's times, these nudges could be a good way of making policy more effective.
And Sriramji, also, Kautilya stresses on your individual duties and your individual rights, and then your responsibility towards a society as a society made up of individuals. And that's also one of the definitions of dharma, that you have to ultimately, it's about, if you contribute to the society automatically grows and it comes back to you on an individual level. So I think that is one very important aspect that you made. I always hear this comparison of Kautilya to Machiavelli. Is it a right comparison? Because I've heard you saying that that's not the right comparison.
Yeah, this is another sort of um, uh, point which I've taken the liberty to mention many times. I think there is an unfair comparison for a variety of reasons. Number one, Machiavelli's text is the prince, for example, is catered towards protecting the king and the kingdom, right? Its goals are very sort of limited. The Arthashastra does not talk about any particular kingdom or, in fact, protecting the kingship. The Arthashastra is about essentially about protecting the welfare of the people. So that is sort of, I would say, the fundamental difference, because a lot of people tend to think that the Arthashastra is about kings and kingdoms and whatnot. That is not the case, because if you look at most of the uh, ideas of kingship that Kautilya had, they weren't specifically to protect the king. He is very clear that the king's role is to protect the people. And if the king's progeny are not competent, the king himself is not competent, Kautilya was very clear that he would change or propose to change the king and his kith and kin with someone who's more competent. So his idea was protecting the welfare of the people. So in that sense, I think Kautilya differed a lot with Machiavelli, because Machiavelli's ideas were predominantly, in my view, catered to a particular sort of kingdom and things like that. Secondly, Kautilya's Arthashastra is mainly a text on Artha, in my view, and it focuses mainly on economic prosperity as a force for political success, which is a concept I don't think Machiavelli deals with. So that is another sort of, and that's why in this book I don't, especially in the subject of economics, there's a lot of, you could compare Kautilya to Adam Smith, which makes sense. But I don't think comparing Kautilya in the case of economics to Machiavelli is valid. And thirdly, the context and the eras are very different. The complexity of Bharat, the wide range of ideas and civilizational sort of diversity that we have is very different to what Machiavelli probably dealt with. So in that sense, I think, and if you look at Kautilya's ideas, economic ideas, philosophies, take globalization, for example, or his form of globalization, was not far off from what we are seeing today. So he was a sort of a much more international sort of person. So I think comparison of Machiavelli to Kautilya is probably the comparison is made on their punishments and some of their sort of rigorous punishments that they give. But I think that's a sort of a shallow comparison. We really look at get away from the biases and look at it purely on the text, on the philosophy, on the context, on their thinking, then I think that answer is clear. In fact, I want to just close this off with one. I mean, this section with one quote, which I often is there in the first page of the book, just to indicate the importance of welfare. It goes like this: Praja sukhe sukham rajnyah, prajanam cha hite hitam, nat preyam hitam rajnyah, prajanam tu preyam hitam. In simplified translation, it is the king's happiness lies in the happiness of his subjects, and his welfare in the welfare of his subjects. A king's welfare consists not in what pleases him, but in what pleases his subjects. So that, I think, therein lies my case. The foundation of the Arthashastra is based on this, my view.
Sriramji, now I would like to ask you this one question that we don't see the banking institutions that we have today in Kautilya's times. And so could you clarify on the banking institutions that were there at that time, and also with regards to temple economics, because in certain parts of the Arthashastra, he says that if it's a bad time for the state, then they can probably make use of the wealth of the temple. So does that kind of justify today's times, the control of temples by the state? I mean, that is one thing that Kautilya is attacked for, whether it's good or bad, but you are the expert, you can tell us.
Yeah, so there are sort of 2 points, right? Two questions in your question. So the first part is on institutions, right? There are definitely institutions which sort of financial institutions sort of existed during those times, albeit with probably lower level of complexity. So, for example, there were statistics officers which were there in most of the villages because much of the governance was decentralized. In these offices, you had people who could go to villages and try to understand about, say, price points, right, of products, and other sort of indicators of, say, wealth, health, and these things. And then they report back into a centralized structure, and there is a sort of a currency centralized institution which determines even the level of money supply. In fact, there are some texts which talk about, which is some Buddhist texts. In fact, Professor Deoder mentioned this to me recently, which talk about how Kautilya altered the level of money supply in the Mauryan Empire to sort of, because of other external factors. It could be a monsoon, it could be higher inflationary levels. So he felt that altering this money supply was also a mechanism that he followed to sort of deal with some of these issues. So conceptually, they definitely had some of these institutions. So large, temples served as financial institutions. I think many people have sort of iterated on this idea. That's why trading centers and temples are sort of very near each other, because the temple was sort of a central to the decentralized governance model in ancient times. So in that sense, I would say that a lot of these guilds were there, which Sanyalji has spoken quite a bit about. So there have been financial institutions. It's just that the form, the structure, and the complexity was different, right? On the question of temple wealth and things like that, I think my sense is, again, I've not gone too much into this because it's slightly out of what I was looking at. But my sense is Kautilya has some of these sort of draconian measures only at the extreme, meaning when there's a complete natural disaster or complete famine, where there is absolutely no other way to sort of figure a way out of survival. So as a last resort, he probably wanted to, use some of these resources. So I think he would have probably mentioned it in that context. Or probably he's just flawed and wrong on this. I mean, Kautilya would himself agree that he's as flawed as we are. Because he mentions, for example, on what things that he agrees with Brihaspati and Sukracharya, for example, and what he doesn't agree in terms of a philosophical construct. So in this, there are cases where Kautilya could be wrong. So this could be one of them. But my sense is most of these sort of extreme measures are given for extreme situations, not for normal sort of situations. The extreme situation is defined by only one thing, a couple of things. One, natural disasters, and two, if you break the law for whatever reason. So I think, yeah, so this is my sort of sense of this.
Sriramji, I think your book is an answer to the millennials and post-millennials questions, that what is there in the Arthashastra? So you tell them, go read a translation of it. As you said, there are just 3 translations over the years, and they don't serve any purpose when you go to read. So I think your book is an answer in the contemporary lingo and in today's scenario where you can just pass it on to somebody and say, you want to know Kautilya's Arthashastra? Here it is. So I think that ways your book is a very important landmark in the contemporary setting. Apart from this, what else would you like to tell our audience? What else can they expect from the books, except for the wonderful graphs and statistics that you have backed up your arguments and your analysis with?
Yeah, I think one thing that I sort of took a leaf out of Kautilya is to be, again, sort of neutral in the entire book. If you have read the book, I sort of make a deliberate attempt to sort of not get my perspective views or even pontificate Kautilya. I sort of allow the reader to just tell them what it is through the book, except for the last section where I sort of summarize everything and then give a personal view on how relevant I think he is. This is a very deliberate attempt because this is precisely targeting the audience that you're talking about. Because most of the discussion today, unfortunately, gets so polarized that, people start, confusing opinion with facts and theories and perspectives. So that was a very, genuine attempt. So in that sense, I think the main purpose of the book is firstly to get this idea that there was a guy thousands of years ago who understood that artha is an important element, that wealth is no anathema to this civilization. And there's a framework based on that, which is not, doesn't have superstition, doesn't fly any kites. We're not talking about things we're talking about practical things which were implemented, policy initiatives and ideas. And this had a structure. All this while, you just had the text. Subject experts did not look at the structure. My entire sort of work is to get home that point. You need subject experts. You need lawyers to look at the Arthashastra and give his legal framework. You need engineers to look at the Arthashastra, to look at what some of the engineering components of it were. You need economists to look at what the economic framework is. And for all you know, 10 years down the line, I might come up with another interpretation, which challenges my own work. But the idea is to get people to debate and discuss about it, and then iterate on this research. Because for all the talk on Kautilya and the Arthashastra, there are barely 2-3 books on the Artha part of the Arthashastra. Either you talk about Chanakya Niti, the political side, or you talk about self-help books, which are well written by friends like Dr. Pillai, or you talk about fiction, but very little on this part. So what I'm trying to also emphasize is young people who are reading this should take the effort to go into subject areas of their expertise and look at ancient texts through that prism, and then develop structures and thinking, and then iterate, debate, challenge your own thoughts, and then develop further research. So that is the sort of second reason. And the third reason is to also, what I would the third sort of request to your viewers is to also uh, read this for young people, who are in school, college, just to give them a perspective, a civilizational sort of understanding that someone thousands of years ago born in this land had a thinking and a wisdom which was far ahead of his time at that time, and it's still relevant today. So, yeah, so that is my basic, sort of goal of this book. My next projects again would be on an extension of this, and into a more sort of common era fold, furthering the continuity that I am sort of seeing from my research. And I would urge them to buy the book again, and then it's available on Amazon. I hope you can see it. And it is also, please review the book. That's another sort of request, because unless you review it, others won't know your comments and thoughts. So please go on Amazon and review the book, and please share it with others so that people get the knowledge. At the end of the day, the success of this book, in my view, is mainly on how, even if a few people can disseminate this knowledge and share it with others, I think that itself would be the biggest success.
I know a few of my friends and colleagues who bought the book, and they're halfway through and they're completely mesmerized with it. I think the Mahabharata, the chapter between Bhishma, the conversation on Dharma, Dharmaraj, and how Raj Dharma, sorry, they talk about Arjun talks about the importance of earth. And how it's the lifeblood of everything that is to be done. So I think earth, these abused words of capitalism and profit making and all that in today's times, welfare politics, I think if one reads your book and understands the Arthashastra, it brings back the respect and the importance of all of them together.
So yeah, sorry, I was too excited to intervene on your last point. It tells you that was the status quo for many centuries. That wealth creation, sustainable wealth creation, sustainable growth, protecting the environment, growing with the environment in mind, international cooperation, internationalized sort of mindset, a strong state with the rule of law. Everything that we talk about in our modern society, most of the things that we talk about in our modern society conceptually, as examples of a very responsible society, is something that you could see in these elements. And on the issue of on the point related to wealth and sort of an international approach, I think Kautilya is far ahead of his times. That, I think, is one of his most underrated but most appealing sort of qualities, to have the thinking of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, not just in thought but in implementation.
So if all of you have been intrigued by this conversation, I definitely have been, then please go rush and understand how you can be better businessmen, how you can be better, statesmen, how you can be a better human being, and incorporate all these elements of business, politics and policy making, and also individual life. I think the Arthashastra, as explained by Sri Ramji in his book Kautilyanomics, will answer all your questions and more. So go grab your copy right now. So thank you, Sri Ramji, for enlightening us and being a part of this discussion. Thank you so much.